In this video, we will talk about the limitation to cross-site HTTP requests and how it affects PyWeb API. We will discuss the need for cross-origin resource sharing, as well as how to set this up in PyWeb API. First, what is cross-site HTTP request? When a client makes an HTTP request to a server and the domain of the client and the server is different, this is considered a cross-site HTTP request. As an example, if I built my website on http://foo.com and I have a JavaScript application, and I'd like to get information from my PyWeb API server located on dnglemon.web.lemon.local. As you can see, they are from a different domain, and this is regarded as a cross-site HTTP request. This request will be blocked by the browser for security reasons, because it is subjected to the so-called same origin policy. Therefore, we need a way to securely support this kind of access, and this is where cross-origin resource sharing, or CORS, come into play. What CORS does, it allows the server to specify HTTP headers that describe the set of origins that are permitted to read information from the server. In this case, my PyWeb API server can tell the client that I am allowing foo.com to get information from the server. Within CORS, there are two types of requests, simple and complex. A simple request uses only specific HTTP headers, get, head, or post. A simple request uses only specific HTTP request verbs, for example, get, head, or post, with no custom headers. All other requests are considered complex requests. While simple request is what you would expect. When you submit an HTTP request, the client submits the get or post request directly to the server. A complex request required two requests, and the first is the pre-flight request. The pre-flight request is submitted with the HTTP request method options. The server will respond with either approval or disallowed to the client, and upon approval from the server, the client can then send the actual request with the actual HTTP request, whether it's get, post, put, delete, or other request methods. Let us illustrate this with an example. To illustrate the concept of CORS, let us make a simple JavaScript application and demonstrate how and why we need CORS. So let's get the list of AF databases in an AF server in our application. For example, if we navigate to our AF server and take a look at the list of databases, we see a list of databases if we scroll down. So we have 3 AF databases in the AF server. And in our JavaScript application, we would like to display the name for these AF databases. And we also want it to be generated dynamically when a user clicks a button. So let's open up Visual Studio and write our application. We will be using Visual Studio to take advantage of IIS Express, but feel free to use any application to write this application. So we'll start a new project. We'll start an ASP.NET Web application, and we'll name it PyWeb API AF Databases. We'll select an empty template and make sure all these references are not selected. Okay, so Visual Studio has successfully created our solution. First, let's add an HTML page. We'll call it index.html. And this will be our single page application. So first of all, let's put a title, PyWeb API course testing. And next, this will be a JavaScript application, and we'll use a popular JavaScript library called jQuery. And what jQuery can do for us is you can make asynchronous calls to the server to get information back, so you don't have to reload the whole page. So to add the jQuery library, we will we'll add this in a script tag. So the type is JavaScript, and we'll get the source from one of the jQuery CDN. And we'll use version 2.1.4. Okay. So for the HTML body, let's tell the user what this application is about. So we wanted to tell them to click a button to get the list of AF databases. And then we'll tell them the AF server is CNG lemon AF. Then we need a button for users to click. And we'll specify an ID for the button and also the text. So get databases. Then we'll have an empty unordered list tag, so that when user click the button, the list of databases will be dynamically added within these unordered list tags. So to give functionality to the button, we will write some JavaScript. So we'll add the document.ready function here. If you're not familiar with JavaScript or jQuery, what that means is that whatever is inside this function will execute when the document is loaded on the page. Next, we need to add an event handler for the button. Within jQuery, you could select an HTML element similar to how you do it in CSS. So we could specify the # and get DB for to select the button based on their ID. And we wanted to add a handler for the click event. So we'll add an anonymous function with after click, and what that means is that when the button is clicked, it's going to execute things within these curly braces. So what do we want to get when the user clicked the button? We wanted to make a call to the PyWeb API server to return all the names for the AF databases. And to do that, we'll use the jQuery function to make an AJAX call. And what this is an asynchronous call to the server, which means that the page, when the user clicks the button, the browser will make an asynchronous call to the PyWeb API server, get the results, and display it on the HTML page without having to reload the whole page. So the syntax for the AJAX call is just $AJAX. And there are a few things we need to specify within the call. So the first, of course, is the URL that we wanted to make the call to. We can copy it from the endpoint that we have already investigated earlier, and this endpoint gives us the list of AF databases. So we'll paste it here. Next, we need to specify what happened when the call is successful. So when the call is successful, what we wanted to do is we wanted to populate the lists here in our HTML page with the names for the database. So if we take a look at what the PyWeb API response looks like, we can see that the data is contained within items. And this square bracket indicates that the items is in an array. So we need to loop through the items array, and in each item we wanted to get the name because that represents the name of our AF database. So in this function, when the call is successful, we wanted to create a for loop to loop through all the items. So we'll do a for loop, and we'll loop through all the items and increment it each time. And for each item, we wanted to add a list item in the unordered list. So again, we'll select the unordered list element in the HTML page. We can use the append function to add our list item, and we could, add our list item here. And what goes in between? It's the name of our database. And to get the name, we are looking at the items array, and we need to specify the element. And then we wanted to populate the name. Okay. So just a brief recap, what this AJAX call so far is that when the button is clicked, I'm going to make an asynchronous call to this URL. And if the call is successful, I am going to loop through all that data.items and append to this list the name for each data.items. And in this case, which is the name of our AF database. Okay, so we have things to do when it's successful. Now we need to add what happened if the call results in an error. So to do that, we'll just display the error message in the console log. So we could do console.log, and we'll displays the response text from the PyWeb API server when there's an error. And finally, we're using basic authentication, so we need to specify an authorization header. So to do that, I need to specify an authorization header, and we'll use the set request header method and specify authorization as the header, and the content of the authorization header is basic, and then we'll use the base64 encoded string again. So I'll copy and paste it here. Okay, now I'll save this and test it out in Chrome. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the Chrome Developers tool, and I'm going to click on this button to attempt to get the list of databases. When I click on this button, you can see that the databases are not returned. Instead, we get some error messages. So the error message tells us that there are no access control allow origin header is present on the requested resource, and the origin is not allowed access. And this is exactly what we discussed before, because our website is hosted in on HTTP localhost 53863. However, our PyWeb API domain is https dnglemon web lemon.local, which is different. So this is a cross-site access, and the browser blocks it by default due to security reasons. We can further take a look at the headers involved in this request. So if you scroll down, and we'll take a look at the request headers. So the first thing we notice that it is using the HTTP verb options. Recall that we have submitted a GET request to get this resource instead of the options. So this shows that our request is a complex request, and this is in fact the pre-flight request that is submitted to the PyWeb API server. Other information that you could see is that the origin. This is the site that's hosting our website. You could also see the access control request headers. In this case, is accept as well as authorization. Recall that we indicate authorization to submit the basic authentication header. If you take a look at the response from the PyWeb API server, you notice that there are no headers that talks about cross-origin access, or that allows this origin to submit its request, and that's why the browser is blocking this HTTP request. To fix this issue, we need to specify some CORS headers on the PyWeb API server. And to do that, we will again go to the AF configuration database, where all the configuration information for PyWeb API is stored. So if we navigate to the PyWeb API instance and look at the system configuration element, and take a look at the attributes, we can see several attributes that are related to CORS. So we can take a look, we can see a few headers that are related to CORS. So CORS headers that specified what HTTP headers can be used in a cross-origin access. CORS methods list the HTTP methods allowed. CORS origins list the origin, which is the domain from the client, as well as whether it supports credentials. So we need to make some changes to allow our JavaScript application to get data from PyWeb API server. So first of all, let's go back and take a look at the request headers here. So for example, origin, we need to add this origin to the list of allowed origins here. So I am going to paste our origin here. Next, we need to add our CORS headers. So if you take a look at the request headers, so here is sending, accept, and authorization. So we'll copy and paste it in the allowed CORS headers. And for CORS methods, we can leave it by default because the pre-flight request is using options and the actual request is using GET. And we also wanted to so that CORS can support credentials. So after making all these changes, we check in. And we make sure that PyWeb API picks up the change. So we go to the PyWeb API server and take a look at the event logs. If we refresh, okay, we can see that the configuration value has been modified, and we see the new information that we have just entered. So now let's go back to our client machine, and we will try to get our list of databases again. Great, so you can see that now we have on the page we've populated with the AF databases, configuration, new, green, and weather. If we look at the console, there's no other additional error message. And if we look at the network tab, we can see what's going on here. So first, this is the first request that we have made after clicking the button. If you take a look at the source, again, this is using the options verb, which means this is a pre-flight request. And then the rest should be very similar to the first request that we have looked at. But now the response header shows something different. So if we take a look, we can see that there are new HTTP headers here. So the PyWeb API responds by saying, I am allowing this localhost 53863 to access my information. Again, we can allow credentials, and it also allows the authorization headers. So when the browser sees this response, it can see that this matched to the origin that the JavaScript application is running at, so it allows the next request. So if we take a look at the next HTTP request, and we take a look at the request headers, now this is the actual GET request. So we can see that this is the HTTP verb, and this is the URL endpoint. And again, the final request has the status code of 200 OK, which means that the PyWeb API is allowing this client application to get information. Next, let's add a new functionality to our application. We'll add a new button and submit a post request that allows us to create a new AF database. So let's go back to Visual Studio. We will close and stop debugging. Okay, so let's add another button here, and then this time we'll do create database and create a database. We'll add a handler for when user click this button. So in here, we'll again select our button based on their ID, and when it is clicked, we'll execute the function within these curly braces. So first of all, I wanted to prompt the user to enter the name of the AF database. So I will display a prompt. Please enter the name of the new database. Next, I wanted to again make an AJAX call, and this time I wanted to, instead of a GET request, I wanted to submit a POST request. And we can take a look at the help files to see what requests we should be making. So in the asset database controller, we don't see an action to create a database. This is probably because to create a database, we should look at the asset server. Okay, great. So in the list of action, we can see that there is an action for create asset database. And if we click on it, we could see the HTTP verb, which is post, as well as the URL endpoint. Asset servers, the web ID, which is the web ID for the AF server, followed by asset databases. So I think this looks very familiar. This might be identical to the endpoint that we've used before, which is asset servers, followed by the web ID, followed by asset databases. So we can use the same URL here. So let's copy this. Again, we'll make an AJAX call. And we'll specify some parameters for this call. So first of all, we need to specify the URL, and I'm pasting the endpoint that I've copied. Then this time I am not submitting a GET request. I want to submit a POST request. So I need to specifically specify the method. By default, it's submitting a GET request. So that's why I didn't specify in the earlier AJAX call. And this time, with the POST request, we need to submit a request body. And we can take a look at the sample request body. It takes the name as well as the description. So we can copy this sample request. And in fact, we'll create a parameter to host this post data. Let's just get rid of the description, and because user have only entered the name for the database. And we wanted to, instead of hard coding the name, we wanted to use the variable name that stores the name of the new database that the users just entered. In addition, we need to transform this into a string. And to do that, we could use the JSON function stringify. Okay, so now we have constructed the request body. We need to specify it in the AJAX call. So in data, we'll take the post body. And again, we need to specify a content type. And in this case, our content type is application JSON. Now let's specify what happens if this is successful. We wanted to tell the user that their database has been successfully created. So we would just do something very simple, which is to display an alert from the browser telling the user that the database has been created successfully. And again, on error, we wanted to display the error message on the console log. And finally, we need to add our authorization header for basic authentication. So this is exactly the same as our GET request. The only difference is that instead of the developer account, we will be using our administrator account because it needs to have write access to the AF server. So we will change this and copy the base64 encoded string and paste it here. Okay, let's test our application. Again, we'll debug in Google Chrome. You can see that we have a new button to create a database. So we'll pull up the Chrome Developers tool by pressing F12 and monitor the console log. Now let's get databases. Okay, get databases is fine. Now let's test the new button, create a database. When I hit create a database, it prompts me for the name of the new database. So I will say new database and hit OK. Then we see a similar error message as before. And if we take a look more closely, it says the same thing, no access control allow origin header is present. And this tells us that something in our CORS configuration is wrong. So if we take a look at the network tab, we can take a look at what's going on here. So if we scroll down to the request headers and take a look at the source, we can see several things. So first, we have access control request method of post. Before we're using get. And also we have we are making the request from the same origin, and if we take a look more, access control request headers is accept authorization and content type. Again, this is a pre-flight request because it's using options HTTP verb. And on first look, it looks like we're making other type of requests that the PyWeb API server is not configured to allow. So let's go back to our AF server and take a look at and see what's happening. So if we take a look at the CORS configuration, we notice that even though our CORS origin is good, our CORS methods doesn't allow a post request, and then the CORS headers also doesn't allow content type as a valid header. So we need to modify these. So first, let's modify the CORS methods, and we'll add post here. So to correlate with this request method of post, and the request header, we also add content type. So let's go back to PySystem Explorer, and we'll add content type here, and click check-in. Again, I'm going to my PyWeb API server and take a look at the logs to make sure that the new configuration has been picked up. So if we refresh the log, it doesn't show that it's picked up yet. If I refresh it again, okay, now I've seen that the new configuration is being picked up. So you could see that I have a post as my CORS method, and my CORS headers include content type. So let's go back to the client machine again, and we're going to try to create a database again. Now, if we click OK, the success message shows us that the database has been created successfully. And if we take a look at the network tab again, we see two additional requests. The first request is the pre-flight request, and we can see that the options HTTP verb indicates it's a pre-flight request, and our response header now reflect the changes that we have made. For example, the allow headers now includes content type. And if we take a look at the last request, which is the second request, this is the actual post request to the endpoint. So we could get the list of databases again. And we see a bug because we haven't emptied the list. So let's go back and fix that. So let's stop debugging. And when user click on the Get Database button, we want it to clear the list. So now let's go back to Google Chrome, and we'll get the list of databases again. And you can see that our new database is there. And if we click again, the list doesn't get appended because we just clear the list before we get the list of new databases. So to recap, we have discussed CORS with a simple JavaScript example. So just to recap on the different concepts, CORS origins contains a comma-separated list of domains from which CORS requests may originate. In this case, it is from localhost, but after you deploy the application to a production server, this will not be localhost anymore, but this will be your destination domain. CORS methods is a comma-separated list for HTTP methods that are allowed. And if there's an empty string, which means that CORS essentially means that CORS is disabled because no HTTP methods is allowed for cross-origin access. This attribute CORS headers lists the HTTP header that are allowed for cross-domain requests. And again, if it's empty, it means CORS are essentially disabled. If you add an asterisk, which is a wildcard, it means that client browser is free to forward any HTTP headers with the request. And finally, CORS supports credentials, indicates whether the browser can send or receive authentication information along with the cross-origin request. And one thing to note that is you cannot use CORS supports credentials with a wildcard for CORS origins. So in short, these settings depends on actual need. You could specify a wildcard for CORS headers, or you can specifically list the headers that are allowed. So the configuration really depends on the need for your custom application.